Okay, I'm back. This is Mrs. Dever, and we're going to do our second example of creating a histogram. This time we're given information about insurance claims made to a company. 170 was the smallest claim made from this data. $2,408 was the highest amount that was claimed. We're going to make a frequency table using 8 classes now, which means we're going to have 8 bars instead of 5 like the last one. Then we're going to make our histogram and a frequency polygon. So, class width. We want to know how wide each bar is going to be. We take the largest data value, 2,408, minus the smallest, 170, and divide by the number of classes. Remember, I just said the question asked us to do 8 classes, so I'm going to divide by 8. That gives me 2,238 divided by 8, which is 279.75. Now, we don't want our class width to be that fractional amount. We always round up to the next integer. So our class width is going to be 280. Let's fill in our limits first. The lower limit is the smallest value, 170. And then I start adding 280 to each of the lower limits to find the others. So add 280 and I get 450. Add 280 and I get 730. And I continue to do this. 1,010, 1,290, 1,570, 1,850, and 2,130. To find the upper limits, well, this one goes from 170 to some number, and this one starts at 450, so this one must go to 449, one less than the 450. So this one must go to 729, because this one starts at 730. And I continue that pattern. This would go to 1,009. The next graph, the bar of the graph would go to 1,289, and then 1,569, 1,849, 2,129. These are 279 apart. This one would then go to 2,409. Once again, if I tried to graph this, there would be gaps between the bars. And so to eliminate those gaps, we create our boundaries for each of the bars of our histogram by going half lower than my lower limit and a half above the upper limit. So this would go from 169.5 to 449.5. Half below the 450, 449.5 to 729.5. And I'm just going to continue this pattern until I fill in all my boundaries. Now you can see there's not going to be a graph, there's not going to be a space between the bars of my histogram. Now to create the midpoints. Midpoints, think back to geometry, midpoints are in the middle. So I want the middle of the limits or the middle of the boundaries. The limits are easier to work with because I don't have decimals to deal with. To find the midpoint, I average the upper limit and the lower limit. So this 170 plus 449 divided by 2 That gives me 309.5. The next one, 450 plus 729 divided by 2. That gives me 589.5. I could continue doing this until I fill in all my midpoints, but I do know each one is 280 apart because that is my class width. So I could take this, 589.5, and add 280, giving me 869 and a half. That would be the number halfway between the 730 and the 1009. I could add 280 again, 1149.5. Once again, that's going to be the number halfway between the 1010 and the 1289. And continue. So I have two methods of finding the midpoint. The last part of my histogram is finding the frequency, and this is a really important part because this tells me how high the bars have to be. So I want to count how many spaces are between 170 and 449, how many data points. So let's go back here. 1, 2, that's all. So that has a frequency of 2. Now I want to count how many are between 450 and 729. So I go back and I count 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I would continue this process until I filled in my entire frequency column of my table. This would end up being 5, 8, 9, 6, 5, and 3. Now that we have all of our data, we can go ahead and make our histogram. The frequency, once again, is already laid out for me, and I have a title, and the X and Y axis are named. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip a couple spaces and begin with my boundaries. So my lowest boundary is 169 and a half. I'm going to skip a space because I have room to spread it out. 449 and a half. 729 and a half. And continue marking these off until I have all my boundaries labeled. Once you have those labeled, you can begin your histogram. My first frequency is 2. My next frequency is 4. And I'm just going to continue making the classes of that histogram. When you're finished, your histogram should look like this. The last part that we're asked to do is to draw the frequency polygon. So just like we did in the first example, I am going to put a point in the middle of each of these bars. At the midpoint. I'm going to go ahead and, this time I'm not going to label the midpoint just because I don't really have the room for it. I'm going to use my straight edge to connect the consecutive midpoints. Now remember, we really don't have a polygon at this point, so I'm going to connect the 0 point to that first midpoint, and I don't have room over here unfortunately, but I would connect this point to the 0 point that comes after the histogram. So there's 3 steps you're going to be doing on these histogram problems. You're going to create your chart, your frequency table, using however many classes you're asked to find, 5 or 8 or 6, however many you're asked to find. Then you're going to construct your histogram, and then if asked to, you're going to take that one last step and create the frequency polygon. And that's all. So good luck with your homework.